Community language learning. So Jim and Sally were talking about their experience with counseling therapy, and Jim said, after 12 years of therapy, my counselor said something that made me cry. And Sally said, what did he say? And Jim said, no hablo inglés. So what would happen if your counselor didn't understand you? Well, that's the joke. Because his counselor didn't speak English, it was not successful counseling. Well, today we're going to be looking at a kind of language teaching, an approach to language teaching called community language learning, which is also called counseling learning, that looks at counseling and language teaching together. Here are some quiz questions for self-quizzing for before and after. So ask yourself these questions to quiz yourself before you listen to this talk, and after, to see if you can remember and recall from retrieval the main points here. So with community language learning, what metaphors define the student and teacher? With this approach, how would a teacher respond to a student complaint? With community language learning, who generates the content for the class? What is the human computer? And what are the good points and bad points of community language learning? So we also call this counseling learning. Community language learning draws on the counseling metaphor to redefine the roles of the teacher, who is called the counselor, and learners, who are looked at like clients in the language classroom. And that's a quote from Richards and Rogers, 2001. Trust and support. So what should we remember about this approach? Well, first, it's important to remember who made it. It's Charles Caron. He developed it in the 1960s. In the 1970s, he was a Jesuit priest and a practicing counselor. In this approach, we want to think about learning and people. Learning is people. People are the main aspect of the learning environment. Learning is people. And so with this in mind, we want to build relations of trust, support, and cooperation. Very important things to build, right? We want to help learners overcome negative feelings. For example, a learner might say, I can't learn languages. That's not true, right? People can learn. And so we have to help our learners overcome any kinds of negative feelings that might limit their ability to improve and grow. And of course, this includes building positive energy. We want to build positive energy in the classroom and in the learning environment. Community language learning is humanistic. So teachers generally care about humans, about the students, right? And it uses this counseling and caring metaphor and makes the method specific with humanistic techniques. So yeah, everybody cares about students. I mean, all teachers usually should care about students. But with counseling learning, we take the metaphor to an extreme and try to use special humanistic techniques to make caring a reality. So teachers teach language in clearly defined ways which value and respect students' feelings and emotions. And it's a non-defensive approach. So the teacher responds non-defensively, for example, to complaints. Imagine a student says, I don't like your class. It's not the way I learned in high school. We need more translation. Where? And the teacher would say in a non-defensive way, I see. You are concerned about the way we do class, and you think translating is a good way. Now that sounds easy, but it's actually quite difficult to respond in that kind of positive, non-defensive way to students if they complain. So it's an interesting technique for being non-defensive. There's a clear approach in this as well. So teachers explain activities clearly. The procedure is clear, the time limit is clear, the reason is clear, and this gives students a feeling of security. And we'll look at this in the coming few slides, right? One of the most important things about counseling learning or community language learning is that the students generate the content for the class. Well, how can students generate content for class? How does that work? Well, when they do it, it makes them more willing to learn, and students use their native language, so they feel less pressure because they're using their native language to generate the content. And so this provides security and they move from the familiar to the unfamiliar, which is also less stressful. The human computer. So with this idea, the teacher is the human computer, and he or she records the students' conversations. The students speak to each other in their first language, and the teacher translates those conversations into chunks and records them in English. And with the final recording, the students have a student-made conversation. So that's how students generate the content. And the recordings and transcripts are used in many ways in class. So what is the human computer more specifically? The students say part of the conversation. The teacher repeats it as often as the student wants. And the teacher doesn't correct. The students self-correct by imitation. So the students speak in their native language, and the teacher translates, and the students repeat, and they learn language that way. Okay, so what is good about counseling learning or community language learning? Well, learners get a lot of autonomy and freedom, and some of them may like that. It's good for students who will have trouble speaking because they can use their native language and then repeat the translations that the human computer gives them. And it can help build a community of learners. It can also be good for an occasional lesson, maybe not all the time, but for an occasional lesson. What are the demerits or the bad points? Well, it might be hard to get the ball rolling on tape. To get the students actually having a conversation might be difficult to get them started. Being free or autonomous is hard for some teachers and students to create all these things on their own without a book or a syllabus per se. And it requires, of course, highly bilingual teachers because the students are speaking in their native language and the teacher needs to translate into English, the target language. It also requires teachers to know about counseling if you really want to go with it and use it fully. You need to learn about how to be a good counselor, right? And in order to do this, we need to resist the way to teach in a traditional way. We need to resist traditions, normal ways of teaching, and use this sort of special technique. So that's a demerit as well. So Richards and Rogers, in their book, they talk about 8 steps: translation, group work, recording, transcription, analysis, reflection, and observation, and listening to the teacher's analysis, and then finally free conversation. But the BBC sets out a 5-step learning process, which I'm going to set out right here. You can see the link for the BBC's 5 steps there. All right, so stage 1, sit in a circle, and the teacher is outside of the circle, right? The students think silently about what they want to talk about, and when they're ready, they list up their ideas or topics for conversation. From their list, they choose one topic for conversation. So that's stage 1, reflection. Stage 2, recording. One student starts the conversation. In your first language, tell the teacher what you want to say. And from behind, the teacher will translate the phrases into English. So imagine the student sitting here and telling the teacher what he wants to say, and the teacher translates into English. And then when ready, they press the record button and the student records the phrases they want to say to the group. So when the student's actually ready to say the target sentence in English, they record it and move on. They repeat this process with the other students. Stage 3, discussion. How did the conversation go? Well, how did you feel about the recording of your voice? And this part is not recorded, so they sort of reflect on the process. Stage 4, students listen to the tape. So they write down the conversation. The teacher helps only when asked, and over time students become more independent. So they're starting to take their conversation, which started in Japanese, translate it in English, record it, and they start to write it down and learn in that way as well. And stage 5 is analysis. Students review the transcript. What tenses were used? What new words were used? What were some problems? So this is a basic and quick summary of community language learning, right? So what can we learn from this? Again, what's good about it? 1, learners get a lot of freedom. 2, it's good for learners who have trouble speaking because the teacher supports them in that. And 3, it helps build a community of learners as well. And 4, it's good maybe for an occasional lesson. Sometimes you might want to try this and experiment with it and see how it goes. So that's my brief summary of community language learning. Thank you for listening.